Sorry to disappoint you, but the moon is flat, Hugh is just ahead in a spacesuit, and the ominous black sphere below the shelter has a perfectly reasonable explanation. For this video, I went through all of Pragmata with some tools to find out what's behind the walls, what's happening off camera and cutscenes, and to zoom in on the tiny little details you can't normally see. If you haven't heard of Pragmata, it's Capcom's latest IP, lovingly referred to by fans as Dad Space. You play as Hugh, sent to a lunar research station that mysteriously went radio silent. You meet Diana, a small android girl with hacking abilities. Together you face off against a murderous AI that's taking control of the station. Capcom's not shy when it comes to Easter eggs either, so I'm going to point out a bunch of those along the way. Heads up, this video covers the whole game from start to finish, so if you care about spoilers, maybe come back later. Oh wait. Let's start at the title screen with Easter egg number 1. If you pop in the freecam here and look just to the left, you'll find Cabin, who's kind of like this game's Claptrap, just less annoying.
Less annoying. Just tried.
I have no idea what you're saying.
And he's just sitting there, waiting, watching. But there's a reason for that. If you sit on the title screen long enough, Hugh and Diana both look off camera, and then Cabin strolls into view. He gives you a double thumbs up and he exits stage left. Following him though, we see he kinda sneaks behind the screen here and then does this weird little waddle before teleporting back to his starting point like nothing happened. Weird little guy. The game starts with Hugh's team arriving in lunar orbit, but pulling the camera out shows it's really just a couple of rooms with some gray rectangles slapped on them. Not exactly space ready. Hugh is floating in the back room here before he makes his entrance. As I mentioned earlier, Hugh is just ahead in a spacesuit. But his two crewmates up front have it even worse. They're just hollow spacesuits, which, to be fair, makes sense. Why model something if the player's never going to see it? Next, I tried to fly into the Earth here, but the game kept redirecting me every time I hit the surface. It was pretty weird, and I genuinely didn't know why it was happening. If you do, let me know in the comments. The team lands and makes their way inside expecting a welcoming party, but it's eerily deserted. From a window here, we get a good view of this part of the station. This changes a bit throughout the game, so we'll take a closer look later, but in the distance, we can see some trams running back and forth, and also these construction vehicles that just kinda poke at the air. The movement gives the area some life and kinda dampens the eeriness until you remember that everything here is autonomous and controlled by AI. The team enlists the help of a definitely not creepy walker robot to clear a path through some debris.
You can't trust a bot.
But soon after, they're met with some tragedy.
You all feel that?
Seismic activity detected.
Hugh is rescued by the little android girl, who he names Diana. Her hacking abilities enable Hugh to stand a chance against the heavily armored robots, and the two become inseparable for the rest of the game. Hugh and Diana take a tram, to a safe spot called the shelter. But off camera, Diana is just floating outside the tram, kinda traveling alongside it. Now here's an out-of-bounds view of the shelter. It's got these entry and exit points for the tram on either side. And within it, you can see several closed-off control units that are going to be revealed later. They're actually already all loaded in, you just can't see them yet. Similarly, every single weapon and unlockable here is also loaded inside these lockers. This is a bit unusual since most things you pick up in-game aren't actually spawned until you open up a box that then spawns them. Same goes for the robot spawners that are found throughout the game. We'll take a closer look at exactly how those work later, but for now you can see that the one that spawns Cabin is there under the map, it's just empty for now. Now, around this time is when you really start to notice the screens in this game. They're all over the place and are used to simulate real-life Earth things, like blue skies with clouds, or in this case, trees with leaves gently blowing in the breeze. But what caught my eye is if you zoom all the way in, you can actually see the individual red, green, and blue subpixels that make up the image, similar to an actual LCD or CRT screen. It's pretty strange for it to have this level of detail. Most developers would just slap a flat video texture on a screen mesh and call it a day. But Capcom went the extra mile for this nice little detail. The solar power plant is your first stop after the shelter. Here you learn about Diana's scanning ability, which is kind of like a sonar ping that shows you how far away stuff is from your current location. Moving outside the map, you can see the scan goes way beyond your immediate area, covering the entire map. Pretty soon we find one of the first areas that's blocked off to us. Freecamming beyond the stuff in the way shows some stairs that descend into this kind of liminal unused space. Some Resident Evil fans will recognize this one. It's a couple of bottles of Dulvey beer. Dulvey, Louisiana is home to the Baker family ranch and the setting of Resident Evil 7. You can spot these bottles all over Resident Evil Requiem too. Pretty cool that they included them here. When you get to the top of the solar plant and get into a cutscene, the first boss immediately spawns in off camera. When the camera's back on it, it teleports behind the door, pretending it's just making its entrance. Once it's defeated, we're ready to head back to the shelter, but there's a couple of things I want to show you on the surface of the moon first. There are these little huts that you can't really see into, and that's because what you're seeing is just a big light box that blocks your view. It's a neat little trick to make these buildings look a lot more interesting from afar. Some of the buildings are bigger than they appear, being partially buried below the ground. And there are just a ton of ladders and steps and walkways all over the place out here. It's a surprising amount of detail for stuff that you really can't see from afar. Back at the shelter, we now meet Cabin, who spawns into existence as this hatch opens up and the small elevator comes up.
Hello, we are Cabin, your one-stop companion for all things shelter. We believe you have a shelter license key in your possession.
You also gain access to some of the other sections of the shelter, including this enemy model viewer. When you're in it, you're taken to a different location to view the models, and if you zoom all the way out, well, you now know what the mysterious black orb was for. I thought it was pretty cool that they decided to do this in-game rather than a separate menu on the title screen like Resident Evil 2. It makes it a little more immersive. Now, this is a good time to show you some of the incredible detail that Capcom put into these models. So, when hacking with Diana, your goal is usually to open the robots, to put them in a vulnerable state for Hugh to shoot them. What's wild is that most of what you see here is actually contained within the model. It's not just loaded in when the model changes state. There are a few exceptions to this, like some of the radiator-looking stuff on bots or small details on some of the bosses, but for the most part, it's all there. And many of the open animations are extremely detailed. It can be hard to notice during gameplay since it happens so fast and the fighting's kind of chaotic, but if we slow it down here, you can really appreciate just how fluid the animations are. They put a ton of work into this. Next is the mass production array, the second of the game's 6 major areas, and it's home to one of the most visually impressive spots in the game. We load into a large warehouse-looking space with these crates zooming around on tracks. Moving out of bounds, we can see that the crates are all on these looping conveyors, just endlessly going in circles. When they move outside your view, they leave the tracks entirely and just float around in the air. Now, here's a scene where Diana just casually almost dies.
What are you doing? You're trying to hurt yourself.
If I break, you can just fix me back up.
You then pass through another printer area where you get a preview of what's coming up, some old-looking taxis in the middle of getting printed. Zooming into the parts that aren't finished gets pretty trippy. I just sat and stared at this for a while and eventually made it my screensaver. There's also a pile of basketballs that look unfinished. However, ducking below the map, you can see that they're fully modeled, just half buried. Pretty soon, the area opens up into this awesome printed version of a city meant to resemble New York. It's pretty chaotic and only gets weirder the more you look around. Up above, you can see the massive printer still working on the city, and in the distance, a bunch of skyscrapers tilting forward at a 45-degree angle. There's a lot of stuff here reminiscent of like the movie Inception, with buildings placed sideways on other buildings. You got rows with cars going up vertical walls, and a shopping district with a bunch of stores just kind of crammed and piled on top of each other in a way that's weird and disorienting. Capcom has said that they were going for the uncanny feeling of an AI-generated city, and I think they really nailed it here. There are a few Easter eggs in this area, but let's start with the first one you come across right at the entrance. There's a video billboard here advertising hidden gems you won't want to miss. Below that, a scrolling ticker reads weskerproduction.com, a reference to Albert Wesker, probably the most iconic villain in the Resident Evil franchise.
7 minutes. 7 minutes is all I can spare to play with you.
If you actually go to that URL though, it's not Capcom's. See, one of the game's early players spotted the domain was available for sale and they bought it immediately. And then they filled it with an endless scrolling loop of Resident Evil memes. Props to this guy for jumping on it so quickly, that's awesome. A couple more in this area, these are quick. We have a Resident Evil 3 poster, a mashup of both Resident Evil and Devil May Cry in one reference. And then this movie poster for Ghouls and Ghosts, the sequel to Capcom's Ghosts and Goblins, a game largely credited with putting them on the map back in the 80s. Now, to pile on the eeriness of this area, this is where you first encounter the Executor Robot, which looks like a giant creepy metal toddler. Hugh has the perfect reaction here. Shortly after you finally get the hang of dealing with these things, you face the area's boss, who eats giant metal toddlers for breakfast. After you've dealt with it, you get into the comms tower and the cat from earlier reappears. Here is where it reveals itself to be a proxy for somebody named 8, an unknown survivor of the chaos on the moon. She begs you for your help before running away and dropping below the floor where you can't see her. The next major area of the game is the Terra Dome, and it's a pretty stark contrast to the last spot. The uncanny valley feel of a 3D printed New York is replaced by a sort of post-apocalyptic, Earth getting reclaimed by nature sort of vibe. Even though the Earth is actually the moon and the nature is fake and 3D printed. I always make a point of looking at the birds in any game where I'm using freecam because usually they're really interesting looking, like the hyper-detailed crows of Resident Evil Requiem. Pragmata is no exception here. You barely see these birds at all in normal play, which is a shame because they're pretty badass looking Robo-Birds. You then get another cutscene with the 8-cat, and with a better close-up look at it, you can tell something's not quite right. If we get super close, you can see more of the robot that makes up this thing, with its cat exterior just being a projected hologram. Pretty creepy, but I'd still pet it. We can also get a close-up look at these butterflies, which are these tiny psychedelic-looking holograms made up of several dots, just like real butterflies. And then there's the beach. Here you get a cutscene where Diana decides she wants to go to Earth with Hugh. Now, obviously the beach is simulated, but viewing it from out of bounds makes that even more abundantly clear. You can see the dome shape of the horizon, the small light that acts as a sunset, and the projectors that make up the scene up on the ceiling. Still, it's a really relaxing setting, kinda makes you want to forget about the horrors of an AI dystopian future and have a little nap, maybe take 30 seconds to hear from today's sponsor, I don't know. Do you sleep like garbage? I sure do. I've been an extremely light sleeper my entire life, and if somebody so much as farts in another room, I'm wide awake. That's why I'm delighted this video is sponsored by Manta Sleep, the company that makes the most advanced sleep masks on the market. They sent me their Manta Sound sleep mask to try out, and it feels like getting a gentle hug from a cloud. It has adjustable blackout foam eye cups so you can fit it perfectly to your face, ultra thin and soft Bluetooth speakers so you can drown out the existential dread, and the mask itself is extremely soft and breathable. They have a ton of different masks to choose from, even white noise machines if you need one of those too. You can check them out at mantasleep.com and use my 10% discount code COFFEE so they know I sent you. There are a lot of robot arenas within the Terra Dome, which makes this a good time to show you how the spawners work. Most things that spawn a robot in this game are hiding out of bounds, whether it's a box underground or a panel in a wall. When it's time to spawn an enemy, they pop into the box and the box raises above ground. The front panel drops away, revealing them before the entire mechanism drops below ground again. It's similar for these wall panels too. The robots pop in just before the panel extends, they're suspended from these hangers, and then they drop to the ground and the panel slides back into place. It's a really neat way of introducing enemies rather than just having them appear around a corner or just waiting around for you. There's a certain suspense that you feel when you're about to walk into a room and you see a ton of these panels, knowing you're about to have a problem. Besides the robot arenas, there are a few interesting spots here to explore. Like this room that contains a mini forest. You can see the roots of the trees extending below the map, as well as the tops extending well beyond the ceiling. But if you look closer, there's an interesting trick here where the devs used small tree models suspended in the air to thicken the foliage up top. There are also a few spots where the way is cut off, and like in the solar power plant, they extend into this eerie liminal space, like you're in the back rooms but in space. Anyway, you finally meet up with 8 here, and it turns out she's a Pragmata android just like Diana. She's been trapped here, supposedly, by the rogue AI that's taken over the station, named Edis. After you leave the area, she kinda just floats in space out of bounds. As is tradition, you fight a giant metal boss at the end of this zone, but on the way there, you encounter what's known as dead filament. This is gonna be a big problem for Hugh and Diana later. Zooming in shows it kinda just looks like a mass of black spaghetti. Basically what happens when I try to 3D print anything. After the Garden Keeper is defeated, you head back to 8 to rescue her, but Edis has other plans and seals off the area while Hugh and Diana make a narrow escape. The Lunum Mines is the first area where you're actually outside on the moon's surface. It was at this point that I realized how well Capcom wrote Diana's character. At first I was pretty skeptical that Hugh seemed to care so much about a robot so quickly, but several hours in, the first thing I thought here was, Hugh, you irresponsible fuck, put a helmet on her, she can't breathe. Yeah, I forgot she's a robot. Dead space. Pretty soon you get an introduction to the boss of this area, a giant robot sandworm.
What the? Look at the size of that worm!
Hugh has the correct response here.
Oh, this is gonna be a nightmare.
Basically, the floor here is lava and you have to avoid touching it, or the worm's gonna sense you and try to swallow you whole. You can see it below the map here, just lying in wait for you to make one misstep. The next time you see it, it's patrolling a larger area in a circle, and you have some other enemies you have to deal with while trying to not get eaten. There are another few Easter eggs to be found in the Lunum Mines. First up is one of the logs you pick up where the writer mentions their record of monster hunts, a reference to Capcom's Monster Hunter franchise. Next, in a room hidden behind a fake wall, you can find a bunch of bookshelves. One of those books is called Fighting Street, just a cheeky little nod to another franchise that put Capcom on the map back in the day. As you descend into the darkness of the Lunum Mines, you have a couple of close calls with the giant metal worm again, like this one where it tunnels on by right in front of you. This area is pretty interesting from out of bounds. When you're moving through it, you can see a bunch of tunnels extending out into the darkness. Behind the walls, you can see where they all abruptly end, just past where you can see. This reminded me of the pipes in Resident Evil Requiem that the girl uses to enter and exit the map. When you reach the bottom, the mine opens up into a large arena where, you guessed it, the fight has it entering and exiting the arena from below. Here you can see it move around at a view similar to what we saw earlier. But what's interesting here are these little segments that pop off of it midway through the fight. They immediately dig into the ground and line up all neat and orderly. They teleport above the surface, take a run at you, and then pop below the map again, sitting there vertically until it's their turn again. Really dispels the illusion of the chaos experienced during the fight. After the boss is defeated, you finally arrive at your destination, the control panel for the rogue AI that's been fucking with you this whole time. Diana manages to reboot the system, and we get another Easter egg that flashes by so quickly most people miss it. When Edis reboots, you briefly get this BIOS screen, which says Capsule Computers at the top. Capsule Computers is the original company from which Capcom derived its name, yet another reference to their humble beginnings. It's at this point that 8 shows up, and the real plot of the game starts to reveal itself. See, the scientist that created Diana in 8 was using them in experimental treatments to try and cure his sick daughter who's back home on Earth. The corporation that owns the lunar station, Delphi, fast-tracked his research without his consent. Unknowingly, they used the scientist's daughter as a test subject and killed her. Hate when that happens. Said scientist, regretting everything he'd done and now dying from exposure to byproducts of his research, the dead filament, he somewhat inadvertently transfers those feelings to 8, who interprets them as instructions to make humanity suffer. So now 8 plans to take a bunch of the dead filament to Earth so it can spread and kill everyone, and it's now up to Hugh and Diana to stop her. Anyway, 8 hits Hugh with some dead filament, which is a problem, and she nearly destroys Diana. The next hour or so of the game gets pretty emotional. It doesn't feel certain that Diane is going to make it, and her dialogue gets more and more bleak as the dead filament clouds her processing.
I failed in my purpose.
What do you mean?
I wasn't good enough.
Incompatibility.
Yeah. I didn't do what he wanted. I have no purpose. Because I'm useless.
Oh, no.
Hugh manages to get her to the Pragmatics lab and starts to get her fixed up. As the machines are repairing her, you get a bunch of screens that pop up midair which play back a bunch of her memories with Hugh throughout the game. If we free cam over to the control panel, you can see a collage of all of those videos. And dipping below the map, you can see a bunch of them pop in and out of existence down there as well. Then Hugh gets to have his first fight without Diana, which doesn't go too well for him. Before the robot jumps through the window, we can actually see that the window's never actually there. When the robot loads in, it spawns with an already broken window. This fight feels pretty desperate in the moment, but I found you can actually just sit there and do nothing until Diana's all better and a cutscene triggers. In that cutscene, you get a button prompt as the robot slowly closes in, making you think you have to be quick. But no, the robot will just hang there in midair until you do the thing. Kinda silly. After that, it's time to stop 8. You take a tram to the central port for the final stretch of the game. It's a pretty badass endgame zone with dead filament infecting the entire area and a giant ominous tower at the center of it all. Off to the sides, you can see some conveyors transporting containers of dead filament to the tower. Out of bounds, you can see it's just another endless loop, like we saw with those crates earlier. Hugh and Diana take a cargo lift down to the base of the tower, which isn't actually attached to the rails it's supposed to be moving on. There's a moment where you traverse another 3D printed New York looking spot, and there's this random Statue of Liberty head poking through the wall. Behind the wall, you can see the entire model, including the tablet that it holds. You finally get to the boss arena where you face down 8, and she's waiting for you there looking like she's casting spells. Unfortunately, there's not much for me to show you here because Capcom used pre-rendered videos for these cutscenes, so I can't use freecam for them. The final boss sequence is another story though. This massive dead filament monster starts chasing you up the tower as you try to get to a transport shuttle at the top, and Capcom pulled some really interesting tricks here. First of all, this thing is absolutely massive. You're basically a tiny little speck in comparison. Zooming out though, the functional part that actually attacks you is only the top half of the monster. The bottom half stays static below and doesn't move. The top part just disconnects to take some swings at you. What's really interesting though is the optical illusion that Capcom used here. See, it feels like you're flying up this tower for this entire sequence, but what's actually happening is you and the monster are staying in place. The tower itself is being pulled downwards, and it constantly rebuilds itself with a piece disappearing from the bottom and reappearing back at the top. This is a form of what's called linear vection or induced motion. Your eyes detect large-scale motion in your periphery, and since stationary objects don't usually have everything moving around them, you conclude that you must be the one moving. Think about if you've ever been on a train and saw another train pulling away from you while you're stopped. It feels like your train is suddenly moving. Basically, Capcom is using your senses against you here, and it's awesome. Once you defeat the big bad, you end up at the top of the tower, which is now all but completely destroyed. Hugh is not doing so great. He's still infected by the dead filament and is pretty much doomed at this point, keeping himself going just for Diana's sake.
I'll do whatever it takes to get you back to Earth.
Let me have it.
No need. Just gotta give it a bit of the old.
In a heartbreaking scene, he gets Diana on the shuttle, uses the battery from his suit to power the shuttle, and sends her on her way to Earth while he floats away to die.
Bad news. This is where we say goodbye. Go find this thing.
His character model unloads here as the shuttle speeds off towards Earth. Diana's model is unloaded as well, just showing us an empty shuttle. There's this little light bar here too that moves along with it. Its job is making sure the shuttle stays lit from the player's view in the cutscene. Diana then lands on Earth, and the final scene shows her on a beach looking up at a 2D moon. And I hope she knows how to swim because the beach doesn't seem to be attached to anything. If you felt bad about Hugh dying, I have some good news for you. There's a secret ending that implies he's still alive. Basically, it's a blank screen with Cabin saying, "Welcome back."
I'm back. What's this? Traveling alone today?
And before that, under the beach, you can find his character model floating around during the credits. I'm not sure why he's loaded in here. It could be that the game was just getting him ready in case you want to start a new game, but who knows. Either way, it was a pretty cool find to end the game. And that's the video. If you haven't played Pragmata yet, definitely check it out. It's got some really satisfying and fresh feeling gameplay, and a surprisingly emotional story. As always, let me know if there's anything you want to know about that I didn't show, and I'll get back to you in the comments. If you like Out of Bounds videos, consider subscribing to this channel. I've been on a Capcom bender lately and plan to do a few more of these on some of the modern RE games. If there are any games you'd really like to see Out of Bounds, let me know in the comments since I'm always looking for more to check out. I love this stuff. I want to thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.